ongoing. But also we know that when the global economy warms up, when we enjoy the good prices for commodities, another negative impact is actually the increase in the import inputs like petroleum, among others. Leaving that aside, when we look at what has actually financed our balance of payments, we see this time round that at least the disbursements for government investments have improved, almost doubled to about $1 billion compared to last financial year, which was about 600 million. But on the other side, when you look at the private sector, FDI is actually not improving. It has been declining over the last 3 or 4 years. And this is a source of worry given the conditions Uganda is in, the anticipation that oil is coming, and so on and so forth, and the good things that are going on. Why is FDI actually not improving? Amongst all the developments, at least the shilling has somewhat been stable. It had a few bumps here and there, but it has somewhat been very stable. And the Bank of Uganda, I think they are not here, has been able to increase its reserves, or the buffer, should there be any problem in the economy. The buffer now stands at around 5.4 months of imports. So what has the policy environment been like? With a low inflation, we know that inflation has been coming down since 2016. And accordingly, the Bank of Uganda had the space to be able to reduce its policy rates. It has come down to about 9.5, or is it even now down now to 9? But what has been the impact on cost of credit? It moved from about 24% to 21%. Many of you here are investors or work with investors, and you should probably appreciate that that can be a very high cost of credit. And accordingly, when we look at the loans, last year we had a problem of quality of loans, but that has somehow improved. But the total, the rate of growth of private sector credit is not yet happening. If you combine the low rate of growth of private sector credit and the low FDI, you can add up to what is happening to private sector investments. We don't have the numbers, we can't estimate that, but that at least gives you some indicators of where private sector investments are actually going. We have another policy arm, which is the fiscal. Thank God the PS is here. The fiscal has not been as expansionary as it should have been, or as a stimuli as it should have been, again on account of the same reasons. In the past, we talked about under-execution of about 2 percentage points of GDP. Maybe there has been an improvement, because right now the under-execution is about 1.5 percentage points of GDP, thanks to the projects that have actually taken off and started moving. On account of that, the fiscal deficit was around 4.9. If we are just comparing to last financial year, no great movement, because last financial year was about 4.8. But if you are looking at what had been budgeted, that's where I'm talking about an unrealized stimuli, because we didn't expand as much as possible. Coming back to the topic of today, revenue, last year we had seen some improvements, going up to 14% of GDP. Unfortunately, this year there has been shortfalls, and I hope the debate that we are going to discuss will highlight some of the reasons why those shortfalls were there. But again, that gives us, reason to think about more seriously how can we mobilize revenues more sustainably. Alongside fiscal policy also comes debt policy, because once you are spending and collecting revenues, in the case of Uganda, there is a deficit, and that has to be funded. This financial year, there was a change in the way the fiscal deficit is funded. There was a shift from the domestic to external debt. And you can see from the charts out there that there has been an increase in the share of GDP external, moving from about 22% last financial year to an estimated 25% this financial year, with a domestic debt remaining around 14%. But there is another animal out there that we don't normally include in the debt because we assume it's not yet debt, and those are the domestic areas that have more or less the same impact on the private sector as other types of borrowing, because it's taking away resources from the private sector that they would have used for investment. Overall, the good news that the country manager talked about, the improvement in the overall economy, is backed up by those developments that I've been talking about. According to Uganda Bureau of Statistics information that we have in this graph, this improvement has been building up slowly, and we hope that downturn in the second quarter of this financial year actually turns up again, so that we can have about 5.5 percentage points of increase in GDP. And where was this coming from? We see the growth across all sectors, but most particularly in the agriculture sector. We saw the rain, most importantly, but we also saw the external demand that has an important impact on cash crops. But much as the food crops actually improved, and we're growing around 9.5 compared to a decline last financial year, which was 4%, the cash crops have actually declined. The only good news we've had is about the coffee. Someone from the coffee industry is out here, and he'll be talking more about this. But the only good news we have on that side is about coffee. So I wonder where the spillover effects from the global economy are ending up, why there is no demand. Maybe it's the regional, because most of our other exports are actually going to the region, and the region hasn't improved that much, so we still have that hurdle to get over. Manufacturing is encouraging. It is hosting us here today, so they've grown at around 5.4% compared to 2.1 last financial year. And construction has also picked up to about 4.8% thanks to the public investments. Services sector led by ICT, then financial sectors, and then trade. So summing up, I'm coming back to that family, that good things have happened. There is a strong recovery, but thinking about some of the elements in the economy, some sectors have already felt it, others not. For a lady who is selling matoke, it depends. If the prices of matoke if the volume of matoke has increased, actually the prices of matoke have gone down. So she can actually buy more bunches to bring to the market. But the transport most likely has also gone up, because it's very hard to access those areas where we are growing matoke. If you look at the husband, it depends, because the spillover effects of the high prices in the global market could be taken over by the exporters and the middlemen, and the guy who is in the market out there may or may not get some of the spillovers from the global market. Again, it depends on a number of factors. And then others might have to wait a little bit, because some of these things do not happen in tandem. They don't happen simultaneously. By the time the spillover effect happens from, say, the increase in price of of cocoa, it will take about 6 or so months to get to the real farmer. So we should not expect that there has been a recovery. The recovery has reached everywhere because there are different ways that this can be affecting the different people. But going back to my long-term average, we normally look at around 5 years. Uganda is growing on average around 4.5% and trending behind others. Not only behind others, but also behind its own aspirations of about 6.7%. So we need to put in more energy to get faster growth. Population issue has been alluded to. If population growth is about 3%, then you have to grow much faster if you are going to grow beyond the 1.5 that we see today. And poverty numbers had also indicated an increase in poverty because not everyone at the end of the day benefits from that growth. So that's Gina. And she's wondering, as we move ahead, is she going to maintain a smile in the outlook, given all those spillovers and the different effects that can happen or get to the household level? Can we keep her smile? I think she's in the garden just ripping matoke. In the outlook, we see that a lot still hinges on the stronger investment and weather. Investments in infrastructure, oil infrastructure, roads, pipeline, so on and so forth. That's for the medium term. For this financial year, I've already stated about 5.5%, but we expect that to accelerate. Continued good weather, but also expectation of reaping from the global demand. Again, the risks actually reflect what the sources of growth are. If you are talking about investments driving growth, then we should be worried about under execution. If you are talking about weather, we should be worried about weather-related effects. If we are talking about global or external demand, the regional factors are still very important. And then if we are talking about getting more resources, debt is still sustainable, but the risks include short-term maturity if we are borrowing domestically especially, poor investment management, narrow export base, and low domestic revenue effort. As I conclude, we argue that a larger fiscal space can support efforts to raise resilience to these risks, but can also help the country finance other yet unfunded development needs. For Gina to smile, she needs good education, because if the parents or the grandparents are being hit by all these sorts of shocks, she might not be able to go to school. But when we look at the current revenue effort, the latest number being, highest number being 14%, this is too low compared to what can be achieved. We estimate the potential to be between 20 to 23%, but we argue that maybe Uganda can work hard and be able to reach about 20%. Sub-Saharan African countries are collecting on average 18%, and we don't want to be counted in the drafts, as we always hear from our leadership. So we can surpass. And then others will come and learn from us. Right now they come to learn, go and implement what has been designed and put on the table here. They implement it and collect more revenues. That is what is happening in Rwanda. It has grown its revenue base gradually, but steadily, and it's now well above 16%. The time is now to support development, and before the oil actually disorients or disorganizes the urge to raise more revenues, because it can be a big disorganizer. But the question is how, and that is what the next presentation is going to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to indulge you on this topic which is close to my heart of how we could raise more revenues in the context of Uganda. Our presentation will go through the recent trends which have been alluded to by both Christina and Rachel. There were some diagnostics on the tax policy. There were some diagnostics on the tax administration. And with those come recommendations that we will be able to see, and that could probably help Uganda. When you look at the revenue story, we are coming from far away, from a ratio of 7.4% of GDP. And as we closed last financial year, we had reached 14.1%. And we want to continue that and be in position to get to the potential that has been estimated at between 18 and 23%. That performance has come through, but it still lags behind the target that we had set in the National Development Plan of about 16%, and also the peer countries. For example, the Sub-Saharan Africa, 18%, which is something we could aim for to be able to do our investments in the public arena pretty well. The graph on the right-hand side gives you what other countries are doing, and the red one, which talks about Uganda, taking a picture of 2015, shows us room for improvement. When you look at the comparison of the revenue mix in Uganda, you will realize that we are now moving towards more financing using tax resources. The grants that are coming through at 0.08% are minimal, and you cannot compare that to what other countries like Rwanda are getting, meaning that if you don't have the revenues, then you only have to borrow. You have a small pie of the non-tax revenues at about 0.03%, and that does not compare very well with our peer countries. If you go to Rwanda, it is 0.9% of GDP. You have 0.4% in Tanzania, 0.5% in Kenya. So there is something about the non-tax revenues that could also improve. When you talk about revenue, you also need to look at the economy. From about 2006, 2007, we clearly see that the economy started growing at a higher gradient than the tax collections. And the questions that we have are why? We hope as we look through the next slides, we should be able to explain this. From an economic perspective, we tried to compute what we call tax buoyancy and tax elasticity, which I can explain in simple man's language. It means that when the economy grows by 1 percentage point, how much more revenue could grow or come out of that economy? We see that between the period 1996 and 2006, the tax revenues or the revenues were responding very well to the economic developments at 1.24%. And a ratio above 1 is pretty good. However, in the last 10 years, that is 2006 to about 2016, we found that this ratio deteriorated to 0.95%, meaning that if the economy grew by 1%, the revenues do not grow in tandem to the economic development. There's something that happens which makes us not catch that extra economic development in the revenue base. To find out why this is happening, we looked at what we call elasticity. Elasticity is a measure that takes care of what discretionary decisions have been made. If there's been any change in rates, if there's been any removal of some items from the tax base or increasing the tax base, items in the tax base, you should be able to see this. Now, we realize that whereas the buoyancy in the last 10 years was 0.95%, discretionary measures brought the response of the revenues down to 0.91%, meaning some of the policy interventions have not given us more revenues, but rather resulted into us getting less if you look at the economic perspective. We try to look at various subsectors. The first one that came out so strongly is agriculture. The economy over the last 40 years has transformed, and agriculture, which used to contribute about 54% of our GDP, now contributes between 23 to 24% of GDP. However, it only gives us 0.9% of the total revenues. Agriculture has changed in Uganda. We used to have that small, substantive agriculture where homes would produce both cash and food crops. A little surplus would take people to school. As we speak now, we've got large-scale kind of agriculture that's happening. You know of people in the economy who have large livestock, people who are doing commercial farming. Cash crop agriculture has taken root. And therefore, there must be some element of change in terms of what agriculture can bring on the table. Many other countries, except South Africa and Kenya, are not doing as well on the agriculture front, but we think we needed to start discussing this as well from the revenue perspective. Industry has been doing very well, contributing revenues that are slightly higher than the proportional share of the GDP. When we look deeper at this, we realize that in Uganda, the construction sector and the mining sector are not playing a fair share of their required contribution. We all know that now mining has taken on a different form. We talk about gold in Masindi. We talk about quite a number of minerals. So before we even get to the oil, we think the mining sector should be doing something. Not only the mining sector, the construction sector, which is almost driving the growth, should look at contributing a little more. Another major change in the economy was services. They used to contribute very little to the economy about 20 to 30 years ago, but now are a majority, bringing in about 47% of the total economic growth. We've looked at this and we've seen that mainly it's the banking sector that is contributing to the revenues that you see in the pie chart there. It was amazing that our celebrated information and communication technology sector was not giving us as much revenue as we expected. There are a number of reasons that have come through as you will see in the reports. One of them is the fact that we have had what we call an eating away of the tax base on excise duties. You all are aware that if you make a telephone call using your landline, you'll pay excise duty. But over time, we've had situations where WhatsApp, Facebook, Messenger can enable you to send a message, can enable you to send to make a telephone call free of charge. And the suppliers of those voice and SMS services will not incur any cost or will not pay any taxes. So that's one. The second characteristics of the ICT sector was the long value chains. From the time you have a mobile company giving you airtime to where you buy it, you'll find multiple value chains. Many of these have come into the tax register, but their role is to claim many credits or claims as much as possible rather than make the payments to the revenue authority. So that's another one. They also manage outsourced services. You have outsourced labor, outsourced towers, and so on. So the sector is vibrant, but we are not seeing as much as it should be contributing in that arena. If you remove the banks, if you keep the banks there, then the sector seems to be moving and contributing very well. That's another way of looking at it, but for time purposes, I'll skip that. When we were looking at the performance of the revenues and the economy in Uganda, one thing came out which was so clear. This is the informality that exists in Uganda. 45% of our GDP is driven by the informal sector. They employ close to 75% of the people in the economy. Key characteristics of this sector, about three. Number one, they transact in cash. Number two, they are hard to reach. And the third component of this sector, they are immobile. Whoever you found here today, if you try to find him tomorrow, you will not find them. Breaking this down, you clearly see that there are some sectors which give us some substantial economic activity, but the informality as measured by the Uganda Bureau of Statistics is as high as 100%. There are some people on the lake who are making a lot of money in the fishing, people in the livestock sector who are making a lot of money. We have food crop, but the activities are informal. Except for a few of these, construction, manufacturing, I think we also have some of these trade and repairs. The others are mainly operating in an informal way with so much of cash, immobility, and the fact that you cannot reach them where they are. This drives substantially the negative outcomes of the revenues that we are seeing and needs to be addressed. We are proposing a little, some recommendations. They are more than what I've put here. One of the key recommendations is to look at the agriculture. There's no form exemption in the income tax arena. We have some exemptions on VAT, food crops, cash crops, agro processing, and we think that it would be good to exempt this sector for equity reasons. Nevertheless, if you craft the tax law in such a way that those who are big do not receive the blanket exemption, you will be able to get its contribution to become a little more than that which they are currently making. One way to do it is to link the informal sector to the points where they make contact with the formal sector. The withholding tax regime is pretty good. If you find many farmers who are selling to big agro-processors, that is a good catch point to get them. There are some of these who export, and they can only come in contact with the value chains, the formal value chains at the export. I mean, if there's no gold payment for gold, tax from gold, at least one day they are going to export. If you can't catch them domestically while they are linking with the formal chain during export, you could find them there. We also are making a case for creating non-tax-based incentives for people to formalize. Up till now, we've been making a lot of leeway in ensuring that these people register. But beyond registration, you need to ensure these people declare their taxes and also pay. There are things that have been done in other countries, such as encouragement of cooperatives or working together in the cooperative arena. We also are saying if we worked on ensuring that we have less of a cash economy. And here 2 points come through. The first one is the use of what they call plastic money. Is there a way we could encourage use of Visa, debit cards, Visa, credit cards, more than what is happening today? There are penalties if you want to pay using a debit Visa here in Uganda. If you want to pay and say you have a card, they'll tell you 3% of the cost. So that one needs to come down. But also, countries like Korea have given what we call credits if you use a Visa card to pay. That's one way of reducing what we call the use of cash economy. Other countries went plastic money, but Uganda had gone use of mobile money. I thought that was a very good way of making people who have been carrying loads of cash start formalizing. And I think we need to look at it from that perspective. People used to carry cash. They now leave a trail using the mobile money approach. We need to encourage that. That way you reduce the informality and not discourage anything that takes people away from the use of cash. Yes, there have been relationships between URA and local governments, in particular KCCA. These could be strengthened, and also where you've learned from the existing TREP pilot, roll it out with other agencies coming on board. We're looking at diagnostics at a policy level, and we go to the value added tax. Christina mentioned something about the exemptions, between 4 to 5%. VAT came through as one of the major consumers of the exemptions that exist, and this is data from the URA. About 2.5% of revenue foregone came from the VAT tax head. We also looked at the data that has been sent by taxpayers, and this what we call VAT offsets, which I'm going to explain, which was huge. Now, VAT offsets happen as follows. When you are a trader, you sell goods to your buyers and you charge VAT. But any person you bought from also charged you VAT. At the end of the day, you get the positive VAT you charged your customer, deduct the input VAT that was charged to you by your suppliers, and if you have a positive figure, you go to URA and pay. If you have a negative figure, you have two options. The first option is to claim for a refund. The second option is to keep it as a negative balance on your ledger, which we call offsets. As at end of June 2017, these offsets were about 2.4 trillion. What does that mean? It means that the offset regime may be abused by the taxpayers themselves. Looking at the data, we have VAT taxpayers who claimed offsets as huge as 5 billion, yet the law only allows you to offset things which are above or below 5 million shillings. So we wonder, which taxpayer can have an offset of 5 billion and does not go to claim for a refund? The issue here is, if you go for a refund, URA will audit you, and to avoid the audit, you'd prefer to keep the offset. Of course, from the URA perspective, they were allowing manual entry of that offset in the VAT claim, and probably taxpayers took advantage. So there's need to make sure that that loophole is closed by the URA, but the taxpayers have also got to check the offsets they are submitting and confirm whether those are right or not. We had the customs law, and within the customs law, we're introducing exemptions. These exemptions were put in place in 2005 when we went into the Customs Common Market Protocol, and we thought there were some exemptions that needed to be looked at again because they may be overtaken by time. We also saw that there are some people who benefit at the import side on the exemption on VAT, yet some of the local manufacturers do not get the exemptions. We saw examples such as salt, excise books. When you look at the law as is today, I know there's been a lot of discussion in the press. The excise books that are not meant for that are not meant to be in the library were not exempt, but at import they were being exempt, which would cause unfair competition between the domestic producers and giving advantage to the importers. We have the deemed VAT innovation, which came in to help cash flow problems in the oil sector and also on the donor-funded projects. This is causing some administration and compliance problems. Administration, we saw that since it was introduced about 2 years ago, URA had not yet changed the returns to be able to capture the data, and because it's cascading between many value chains, they are saying we don't know how far to go to collect this data, something that is changing, but also it's causing more demand. More people are saying we can also benefit from this, which is something that may not be sustainable in the future. So the recommendations around here are basically, let's look at the value added tax exemptions that exist. URA should close the VAT offsets loophole created in the returns, but also focus more on auditing the offset claimants, because we think there may be problems in the offsets. Those need to look at the exemptions under the customs law, because those are not in the VAT law, but they are under the customs law. And also relook at the deemed VAT innovation, because you need to either go back to the standard VAT regime, exempt if that's what you should do, zero rate if that's what you should do, but the deeming is causing administration and compliance issues which may result into losses. The second major tax type that we have is the personal income taxes. We discovered that this gives us 2.3% of GDP. It's giving you about 10% and the lowest in the region. Rwanda brings in 3.5%, Kenya 3%, Tanzania 3%, Kenya is about 6%. We looked at it, and it's good in as far as satisfying the objectives of equity and simplicity. It's progressive in nature. Progressive in nature. We saw that we have problems with collections from the informal sector and high net worth individuals. We did not compute the costs of revenue foregone in the exemptions, but they exist. And the challenge with the exemptions on the personal income tax is that many of them are going to people who are what we would call those who are in authority. If you call and say allowances of a member of parliament are exempt, if you say the judicial officers are exempt, those people are in authority. The security sector, they are in authority. So if you don't pay tax, then you cause challenges on those that pay. They say, why do we pay? And yet those who are wielding authority over us are not paying. We're making recommendations there, and mainly look at the exemptions. Also look at the indexation of the PIT brackets, because if you don't index, then you'll keep getting pressures to exempt. Excise duty, it's declined from 3.5% in the 1990s to about 2.5% of GDP. We saw that over time the policy moved away from penalizing externalities and raising revenue to using the excise duty regime to encourage use of raw materials, local raw materials. You will see this in the cigarettes, the regime on beer, on wines. On cigarettes, we thought that the rate that was currently being charged could be increased. And on the other hand, there was a preferential treatment between the tax rates imposed on locally produced cigarettes vis-a-vis those that are imported, and that was in contravention of the Tobacco Control Act. Aviation fuels are exempt from excise duty, and we did not get a direct linkage between the ticket prices and this exemption, which we think needed to be looked at. We found an environmental levy on cars, but normally because cars pollute using noise and the atmosphere, there's normally a broader-based excise duty that could be imposed on both motor vehicles and the motorcycles. We computed the exceptions there, and we saw about 0.43% of GDP that we forego in revenue, which could be recouped. When you have an excise tax policy which emphasizes raw materials, it means you must have a URA officer in every factory to police the issuance of raw materials and look at the production process. But over time, URA had reformed and moved excise duty officers from factories, which means the existing tax administration is not supporting the existing tax policy unless you change the taxation policy. Indexation was also a problem. In other words, rates set are not indexed to reflect inflation as we move along. I'm trying to run to create space for discussion. So the recommendations are ideally addressing those challenges. You could harmonize rates on cigarettes, alcohol. You could impose the excise duty based on alcohol content rather than raw material. You needed to look at the exemption on aviation fuels and see whether it's giving you the objective of reduced ticket prices. If not, then do we forego revenue? Does it still make sense? And then review of the environmental tax in preference for a broad-based excise duty on both motorcycles and motor vehicles, and then look at the tax administration. And if you maintain the raw material-based excise regime, go back and deploy excise officers, which would be a step backwards, but necessary. Corporate tax, still low performance in the region. Tax exemptions still talk about a major challenge in this area. What we also saw is the fact that when you make money, you are allowed to take expenses off your revenue and your tax on the net level. But the taxpayers in Uganda are allowed to claim other expenditures, which were costing us about 0.42% of GDP. And we don't know what these types of expenditures are. It is aggregate data, an area that needs to be looked at because it's costing us quite a loss. We also have losses that are carried forward. They are perpetual in nature, and they were about 9% of GDP, or in terms of revenue, 3% of GDP. We think these may not be as genuine as they look, and they may have caused some likelihood of abuse. We will go straight to the recommendations, and there we are saying the exemption story again. You need to audit these other expenditures and also consider capping the losses that are being carried forward perpetually that have accumulated to about 9 trillion by end of June 2017. We've discussed the tax exemption story almost on all tax instruments. And we are saying that removing exemptions is what you can look at, but in an organized manner. What we are saying is that exemptions are good if they address a particular market failure. If there's a problem in the market and you think an exemption is what should address it, you need to look at it and give an exemption. However, you need to do it using a proper governance framework, which says that you know all of these, and you can never know what you have unless you don't have discretionary exemptions. The second one is to measure and see how much they cost you, and is it worth it? Is it bringing the proper behavioral responses or creating what we call non-compliance? The third one is to ensure that they are properly authorized. The authorization of the exemptions is critical, and whoever asks for these must be able to show to government the benefits and the costs to government, and whether this is the only alternative. And finally, you have to continue monitoring and saying, we have them, we review their meeting objectives. If they don't meet objectives, you eliminate them and you keep moving. You can't have an exemption that came in 20 years ago and it's continuing to run, and you say it's addressing a particular problem. On the tax administration, we know that URA is the main tax administrator. We all are aware that there have been reforms that have been taking place right from the creation of URA in 1991. We had the reforms on the organizational structure in 2004. There's been automation using e-tax, online services, as World, ECT. And this institution must continue to be efficient. We looked at one measure, which is the tax administration, and we are seeing a trend where by 2012, 2013, its recurrent cost to revenue collected was 2.65%. Now it's about 1.74%. And the question is it improving efficiency or being cash strapped? Government has launched a deeper review to see whether it's efficiency or investment side, but we think this must continue to be looked at and get some element of improvements. To collect revenue, you don't need only the revenue authority, you need the tax policy department, and the capacities therein must be strong. We have local governments that collect revenue, currently at 0.2% of GDP, which is low compared to regional arenas. Uganda invests in about 32 public corporations, and in other countries, these public corporations pay dividends. The central bank must pay dividends. If you have a departed Asian Custodian Board, it must collect revenue, give it to government. UTL must pay dividends. But we are seeing minimal revenues from state-owned enterprises, and yet these also must contribute to the fiscus, or else they become a fiscal risk to government. There has been automation in URA, but we also need to see that this automation can help the other revenue agencies that support revenue collection in tandem with the improvements in human resource capacity and the processes. Sorry. Hold on. So here we are saying that let's improve ICT more, let's share information more, and then improve capacities of all revenue agencies, URA, tax policy, local governments, and the unit that monitors state-operated enterprises. Interagency relationships must also be strengthened, both logical and physical. In other words, computerized and the physical interface between these revenue agencies. Christina mentioned the issue of public service, service delivery, and this is what creates social contract between the taxpayers and government. The moment you start collecting taxes from citizens, they will also need you to deliver services to them. If you don't, then they will feel cheated and withhold on their compliance obligations. So this must be mutually beneficial, but the statistics we are seeing here are such that we need to do a lot of improvements. We used 2, health and education, and you see that when somebody goes to a hospital and finds absence of about 52%, or if teachers are not in the classroom at levels of 56%, then these create major challenges. If you go to a hospital and the accuracy of a diagnostic is about 56%, then people will feel obliged to save their money, not to pay it in tax revenue, and use it privately to meet their own challenges. URA began a process of showing taxpayers what ministries, departments, and agencies do. We need to encourage that and make sure it yields results. We have seen improvement in public finance management and transparency on the expenditure side, and as Christina mentioned, we need to see it on the revenue side as well, and fight corruption, which seems to be a big animal cropping up these days. With corruption, taxpayers would feel like we are cheated if we send our money over to government, and beyond educating them on what they need to do, corruption and transparency needs to happen a little more. So in terms of improving revenue administration and the social contract, we are saying invest more in transparency, regularize the reporting of the cost of the exemptions through the budget process, link taxation, the public expenditure, and effective service delivery. Without effective service delivery, we cannot improve and capture the 2% or the 5% that is still missing. Let us fight corruption and use the domestic revenue mobilization strategy that is being developed to build a coalition around revenue mobilization, improve coordination between state agencies and non-state actors. I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
I had initially asked that Rachel invites Moses, but clearly she said on to the next presentation. So we have been listening, and the majority of you may not have known who was making the presentation. So that was Moses Misach Kajubi. Moses is the Senior Public Sector Specialist at the World Bank. Thank you very much, Moses. Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause. Well, the PSST requested that he does make some remarks because he has another engagement. So allow me to invite Bwana Keith Mwakanizi, who is the Permanent Secretary and Minister of Finance. Please do come.
Your Excellencies, the World Bank country manager, ladies and gentlemen, I was enjoying myself. I thought this program was has gone on very well. So I had come with remarks which I have here. Then as the presentation was taking place, I decided to change because I was going to be boring. And I don't like to bore public. So I'll make one or two remarks and I go away because I think things are going on very well. When did I become Secretary of Treasury? Yeah, 13. So when I became Secretary of Treasury, in 13 May, I set myself 4 targets. Or we set ourselves, led by myself, 4 targets in the ministry. One was to get GDP because it was growth back to track because it had gone down. 2 was to clean up, if you recall at that time, public expenditure was dirty and needed to be cleaned up, including what they call governance questions. 3, raise the ratio of revenue to GDP to above 15. And 4, I said to see how we do is to improve Uganda's competitiveness in the region. It's 5 or 6 years later, we seem to have done very well on public expenditure cleanup, I think, as people are saying. And I think GDP is starting to going up. But we have still, on the revenue target, we're still far behind. So I was asking myself, even over the weekend when I was free, why have we failed to get revenue to GDP, achieve our target, compared to other areas which seem to have gone very well? And I think that's a question. Did we put more efforts in the other 2 and less effort into this area? I'm beginning to think so. And therefore, time is now for us to deal with this problem. Now, second one, and I was going to talk about the background and the whole political economy. Because the other side, the experts have done. I didn't know Christine is a tax expert. I knew the Uganda'S, I think. So I was not surprised by his excellent performance, but I was surprised by Christine. He did seem to know. I thought he was on the other side like myself. Now, so why? What can we do? And I just reflecting myself, because I was being the leader in all these areas. I think the efforts have been weak. But let me talk about the political background, where we are now. Because we can't fix the past, we can fix only the future. As Africa has entered into a new contract. So, few years ago, many years ago, you don't not hear presidents, prime ministers talk about, wherever they go, about investment and economic growth, infrastructure and all this. Now that's a talk. As you enter into this multi-year, very expensive programs, I think the politicians have now realized we need domestic revenue. So I think the political, what do you call it, commitment now, compared to the past, is it commitment to revenue raising is much stronger relative to the past. So, is the URA here? Is the tax policy here? Now, I think that's part of the problem. Because I'm surprised they have not come to, at least to defend themselves. So, we see now, today, the major, if you ask me what makes me and my colleagues and URA not sleep is that we are under immense pressure to raise revenue domestically from the political angle. But of course somebody is going to say, if that's true, why do you still have tax exemptions and this noise that you see there? You will always have that kind of contradiction, whether you like it or not. And to lament about it is wastage of your time. Let me give you an example this morning. Does anybody have a monitor? I saw Kajubi panicking because people here are religious. They fear to talk about religious issues. I don't know why. I thought religion are supposed to liberate us. Now, in there, so this is the conference being arranged by NTV. I think it's a sister of the Monitor Publications. Their sister has now put a headline, I think on page what? Taxing, the government is now taxing Bibles and Qurans. And the first thing which I received from the political minister and even the Commissioner General, what was in his mind, and probably he was also being bashed, was, why are you taxing Bibles and Qurans? Aro. But I need to be careful. And so, I'm giving an example, the contradiction of the political systems. Because I see in the countries, for example, where majority of people are still strongly religious, here that you are taxing Bibles and Qurans is like committing the worst crime. First of all, I think they should pay taxes. So if you want to know my views, and I think I'm a very strong Christian, I think all of us should pay taxes without intimidation. Short of this is a joke. That's number one. Because we need, in taxation, as Wanakajubo was saying, there must be some level of equity. Now, then Kajubi, again, I thought he was going to be courageous because he's not in the government like me. So there I was disappointed. He said, you know, nicely, the politicians, some claim the Constitution gave us exemption. So it could be true. Some are we are hiding under a legal framework, allowances. I think Africa, if we are to get people to pay taxes, we must courageously tackle this problem of us, we leaders, exempting ourselves from paying taxes. Whether it is through the law or otherwise, we must be the first people, we leaders, to pay taxes. And therefore, to tax a lowest cadre in Ministry Y, and he pays as you earn, and you don't pay somebody who gets the highest revenue, income in our society, is a joke. I am as clear as that. We must tackle that problem. And, well, it's not only in this country, it is across. Because you see, when you are dealing with this, like in East Africa, we do what we call, is it contagion problem or how do you call it? They will say, but in Tanzania, judges don't pay taxes. I'm telling you what I face every day. And judges will come, it's a very strong lobby, and say in Kenya and Tanzania, they are not paying taxes, and they are justified. And the presidents in Kenya and everywhere, they are not paying taxes. Aro. Yes, we must now reflect and move to say, if you are getting higher income than this one, you should pay taxes more than me. Otherwise, even me, I feel grieved, and I know this because civil servants come to me, say, boss, but you are taxing us. Even the people when we are doing taxes here, let's be face the truth. When we are doing tax policy and revenue, they say, but boss, fortunately for me, I'm taxed. So it's not the answer. But I'm trying to say, even myself, all of us must pay taxes if we are to move forward on a number of these things. I had put a question mark that we need to move from general talk analysis to general analysis towards benchmarking. And I think that's what made us move faster on the expenditure side. On the expenditure side, I think we had a framework. We have a framework. I was looking why the other one was strong and this one. Framework in which all of us, every quarter, we meet a group, the task force, under the chair of myself or my deputy, including all stakeholders, civil society, and we benchmark what to achieve next together with all of us. And I think we need now on tax revenue to do this. So I was very grateful to the World Bank when I saw Kajubi saying, here there is a weakness, here there is a weakness, something needs to be done, and it needs to be done. So having said that, I think we have revenue expenditure framework, but revenue expenditure framework, which probably I'm the one who supported it and initiated it, will not work if we don't take much more courage. And that's what I was trying to say, that all of us must deal with these problems to get things done. Of course, on the expenditure side, I agree, much more needs to be done on service delivery, because it impacts on the other side if people are not getting proper service delivery, and therefore much more still needs to be done. Thank you very much. I thank the World Bank, I thank all of you. Give us the recommendations, and we see how together we implement them. Thank you.
Another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Keith Muhakanizi. Well, his remarks move us very quickly to our third session for this morning. I'm going to request a couple of people to join me as we move to this panel discussion. I must mention, as you noticed, when Keith asked for the URA, the Commissioner General had confirmed she would be here, but at the last minute and on short notice did mention that she was called for a very urgent meeting. I'm sure you can guess where, and didn't make it. But we have one or two people from the URA who are here with us, but I guess they are not allowed to speak on behalf of the URA, so I will protect them for now. Allow me to invite the Commissioner Tax Policy to join us this morning at the front. So Moses Ogwapus, please join me at the front. Moses will also be joined by Julius Mukunda, who is the Executive Director, Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group. They'll also be joined by Daniel Birungi, who's the Executive Director, Uganda Manufacturers Association. And finally, Ishak Lukenge, Chairman, Africa Fine Coffees Association. So I guess we are in a very uncomfortable position, because it would have been nice to have someone from URA on the panel, but and a lady, I am also being informed. So I don't know whether Moses will represent URA, but I doubt you will represent any lady on the floor. However, this is an open session. I will be coming to the floor for some contributions. I've seen quite some very important people in the matters audit amongst us, and it would be nice to hear their perspective, because they do audit our accounts and they share tax information with various corporations. So it would be nice to hear from them. So I will begin with you, Moses, because we are looking at a macro level fast, and we want to have this conversation based on the presentations made by both Rachel and Moses. And we're looking at the projection, our revenue trajectory for the next, financial year. I know the budget process has been done. You have an estimate in mind. Question is, can we collect that money, and can we collect more? Just share with us.
Thank you, moderator. Allow me to first appreciate the World Bank for the partnership that they have with us, and other donors to support us to improve our tax effort. The ministry and URA, we indeed share the thoughts and the findings that Moses articulated in his presentation. Coming specifically to your question as to whether we can attain the targets that we've set ourselves to attain in the budget, I believe you're referring to the budget for 18-19. Yes, it is our expectation that we shall attain the target of about 16 trillion. The beauty with what is going on is that we are working with the World Bank. This report was done a couple of months ago, and you won't believe, but some of the findings in this report have already been integrated in the budget framework for next financial year. So we are very optimistic that we shall attain the target, and probably we can hit a higher target than we've set ourselves to, because we believe that yes, our capacity is in the range of 18 to 20, as articulated by Moses. So we are doing everything possible to see that we can actually improve our tax effort.
Thanks, Moses. I'll come to you, Julius, because you look from the outside, and your job is normally to offer some sort of oversight role outside what Parliament does on what the ministry is doing. It would be nice for you to, look in and tell us. For example, and Keith was mentioning this, so there is issues on consumption and trying to be able to do as much as possible with the money that has been collected through the tax policies available. But also, and at the macro level, are they able to actually meet those targets that have been set for them, looking at the shortfalls we've had in the past? And these were highlighted even in Rachel's presentation. Yes, the money is there, and we can, as the hashtag we have, Uganda can, we can actually collect this money. The big question is how, and are they able to?
Yeah, thanks. I think first of all, when I received this report, for me was I thought probably it was not a World Bank report. Because for the first time somebody is telling you very candid that actually that you are actually naked, you need to dress up. What I'm trying to say is that being spot on what we are supposed to do. And that takes me to what he's talking about. I would believe him if I would see that actually there are some serious progressive steps. The courage the permanent secretary was talking about. In fact, I wanted to ask him about the courage, and he just left. Let's look at the. I want to look at it from two perspectives. Number one is, what would you want to tax to generate more revenue? You can only do that if you have increased economic activities. And one of the ways we know that we can have a value added in terms of our economic activities is agriculture. We are very happy simply because Mother Nature has granted us this season that we have rain. But we know very well rains are likely to go away. So what have they done to invest seriously to ensure that if we don't rely on this rain, we can rely on something else like irrigation or some other things to ensure that our productivity stays up front and that we can be able to have more resources to that. That's number one. So again, you begin to question that. The other important element for me is opening the spaces. The PSST is very categoric. He has done extremely very well in public expenditure. We can be able to mention a number of leakages in the public expenditure in service delivery. But the taxation part is extremely closed. And I usually say these guys are extremely very bright, because the small department had determined the taxation policies for this country with limited input. But I can tell them, if this space is opened and we are able to predict what is likely to come out in our taxation proposals, and we advise them early in advance that some of these are so harmful, please don't touch them. Like the 1% on mobile money, please don't, because now we are being told that it is one of the ways that we are increasingly making people to get into the formal sector, because everybody is transacting on mobile money. I can tell you then we can say yes. The potential of even 23% we are talking about, we can even go beyond that one. And at that particular moment, yes, if those are done, I can tell you we have the potential, but much more needs to be done. Thank you.
We'll come back to you, Moses, on tax policy. So we are collecting 14% of GDP, and we actually can do even the 20, and 23% is the 20%. Never mind what our neighbors in Rwanda are doing at 16 and the others. You know, if you're looking at the proposals that have been shared by Moses and Rachel, and looking at the conversation around the tax exemptions, a conversation which both spent quite some time on, have we able to start looking at those leakages in those places where it's become government policy to actually interest investors, or bring in as many investors as possible? Even when they've finished their investment, we are still offering them exemptions. And are we looking at that and looking at the policy and saying, wait a minute, maybe we need to revise our tax exemption policy and review it in the mind of how much money we are losing and leaving on the table?
Thank you. Actually, in the next budget we have proposed more exemptions. So, sort of contrary to what Moses is proposing. And I like to say that exemptions are not bad. And everybody, everywhere in the world, exemptions and remissions and exceptions are administered in all tax systems. What is very important from what Moses shared is that they must be done transparently, they must be accounted for, yes, and they must be relevant for the cause for which they are granted. And I like to try and convince you that contrary to the perception that is out there, and this is very strong view, which to some extent insinuates that government has been kind of reckless in administering exemptions. It is not true. And let me try to convince you. About 75% of the imports which come into Uganda, in terms of value, are exempted. That's not by government of Uganda. This is a common decision at the East African level. And the focus of the goods which are exempted under the EAC is largely plant and machinery, raw materials, donor-funded goods, including the World Bank, unfortunately, but for good reason, because much of this money comes from the other countries which they would have paid taxes anyway. The citizens of those countries have paid taxes, so the condition is that we cannot use that money to pay taxes in our country. The second category where we are losing, so to say, revenue is under VAT. We have a section in the VAT Act, which is the second schedule and the third schedule. The second schedule has supplies which are exempted. And these include unprocessed foodstuffs, which is really things consumed by the common people. Maize, I mean the maize from the garden, the bananas from the garden, all the matoke which comes from, where do you come from, Mugisha?
Kabale.
From Kabale, from
Very little
Kayunga.
comes from Kabale.
What comes from Kabale? Irish potatoes?
Yeah.
There's no VAT that we charge on the things. And then you have educational services, UPE, USE, university education, medical services, financial services. A lot of the things don't attract VAT, and we know they contribute a lot to GDP. And then you have inputs for agriculture, which again, as my PS said earlier, is a contradiction, because working with the World Bank and other partners, we attempted about 2 years ago to remove most of these exemptions, but we were strongly advised by civil society. They had a big campaign against taxing agriculture. Our argument was that since, from what Moses has presented, only 1% of revenue comes from this sector, maybe an indirect tax would be a better option for us to tap into this sector. So you can see that the 4% which was referred to is not out of discretion by government. No. These are statutory exemptions. They are in the law, and they are administered transparently. If you take the case of income tax, we have about 4 sections, are they sections, Jared? 4 sections in the Act which provide for deductions for companies to reduce, so to say, their chargeable income from their gross income. This is by law. Now, a conversation should be based on whether these deductions are legitimate, whether there is mischief involved in this, and this is where we need to develop a smart approach to account for any revenue which is not collected, no matter how, including these particular cases where companies legitimately are allowed to expense certain things from their chargeable income. The discretion, what would be like discretionary exemptions that should be of concern to the public, is what government has extended to what we've considered strategic investments, like the roofing plant in Namave, like the Bidco plant in Kalangala, like the Sipla plant in Luzira, a few of those. We, by Constitution and by the Budget Act, every quarter we account to Parliament any exemptions or any exceptions that the ministry or government extends to the public. And we do that religiously. So I'd like to convince you that We are not reckless as far as exemptions are concerned, and we are committed to ensuring that we have a very transparent approach dealing with these issues. That's why in the next budget, you will not see any more of those sort of discretionary things. We decided to put them in the law. They will be debated by Parliament. If Parliament approves, I'm sure my friend here has had an input into it, then we'll agree on a smart framework for who gets the exemptions and how do we account for these exemptions. I hope I've...
Thanks, Moses. I'll come back to you because there's one or two other recommendations that were made by Moses I would want you to shed some light on. But, you know, the discussion, and for those of us or those who are joining us on TV and are just following this conversation, we are in our session and looking at how Uganda can mobilize more domestic resources for sustainable development. And the big question I'm asking the gentleman here is how that can be done. I want to move to the Executive Director, Uganda Manufacturers Association, Daniel Birungi. The report, as Rachel was presenting, showed quite some improvement even in the manufacturing sector. However, I also picked the same information from Moses that said the high-end taxpayers, who I'm thinking fall a lot or sometimes under the manufacturing docket, are finding ways, smart ways, of actually paying less tax, either through the system or through, of course, any other means, official or unofficial. Share with us, first of all, how much you are in your sector can do and what needs to be done for you to be able to actually contribute more to this domestic resource mobilization.
Thank you, Maurice. And for all, welcome to UMA. What we can do? Well, first of all, I think at 31% of tax collections as a contribution from manufacturing, it's quite a good percentage so far. But yes, there's room for improvement, certainly. There are areas where there are still leakages. And we've engaged government on a number of these areas. We've pointed out that there is need for initiatives that ensure that, for example, the payment processes for when we work with government are not as drawn out as they are. Because if I've supplied and then I'm getting my payment after more than 6 months, that is working capital held up, which means I'm not able to reinvest that and grow my business. We've talked about the need to expand into our neighboring markets. We have natural markets as Uganda. DRC is one of them. South Sudan is one of them. They're very vibrant potential markets. DRC is an $8 billion market. And we feel there should be clear direction on how we can penetrate these markets. One item we've proposed is the export guarantee scheme. You do remember what happened in South Sudan when there was a bit of chaos and insecurity. A lot of people lost their money having invested it in there. We feel the presence of an export guarantee scheme that enables us to penetrate these markets with the knowledge that in the event of such an eventuality, we're able to pull out with our investments intact are vital. Of course, we welcome the bilaterals that have been going on. Recently, there was one between Uganda and DRC to open up that particular market. But South Sudan is still there. And what are we doing to ring fence that for us? Then, of course, the 5% growth that we've seen in the manufacturing sector is partly as a result of initiatives towards building the local content initiative in Uganda. What that has done is that for areas such as steel, areas such as cement, areas such as textile, they've stimulated growth, and we have the figures to prove it. That in these areas, because of the reservation guidelines that ensure local sourcing, growth has been there. Now, how do we learn from these and then expand these lessons to the other areas so that we can stimulate further growth in those areas? So those are some of the suggestions we have going forward. But of course, another one is we need a more predictable tax policy.
Yeah.
Because in the middle of the year, having planned, if suddenly there is a notice that says this is the new rate of tax on, let's say, exercise books, what does that do to the ability of a business to plan ahead? What does that do to the ability of a business to forecast? Because at the end of the day, our ability to forecast is the key metric on which we develop our sales, we develop our pricing. Access to finance has already been mentioned in the report, that finance is still very expensive for the domestic borrower. If you're borrowing from a commercial bank as a manufacturer at 21%, there are hardly any manufacturers who make that kind of money as return on investment. Couple that with the fact that this is a short-term kind of loan, 3 years max. When are you going to make that kind of money? So these are some of the other areas that need to be touched on to ensure that we generate more revenue domestically, I believe.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Ishak. Ishak comes from the coffee sector. Looking at the report and of course even the projection that we will do a little better than we have in the last financial year because of the good weather, which of course feeds into your sector. Coffee did post quite some good numbers from the 2015-16 numbers, and we're looking ahead and wondering how much more we can capture from your sector in the next 2 years. You want to share with us insights into what the sector is doing and how much can be done to actually bring more foreign capital into the country through coffee?
Is it on?
Yep.
Thank you very much. From the presentations of Rachel and Moses, they show the figures of coffee exports and tea exports going up. But I think we need to do more, not the usual, is we need to go for value addition. Because most of the exports that Rachel mentioned in her report is, these are raw and bulk. But I think for Uganda and I think for the East Africa and other African countries, what we need to do is to add more value to our products. For coffee, some efforts have been done to add value to coffee, and I think we have seen also more value addition to tea and other products. But I think we need to make sure that we have a deliberate policy on adding value, which will, at the end of the day, will increase on the amount of US dollars and create more jobs in the process. Because Moses asked, what is, I think the word was, what is the element of change? This, if you put it right, the element of change is to add value to most of our agricultural products. I'm thinking of creating a processing zone for adding value in the various regions of the country, other than looking at Kampala or the central region as the only area where we can add value. You find mangoes being transported all the way from the north. By the time they reach Kampala, half of the load is rotten. But if there was a value addition in the north, there's value addition for mangoes in the eastern part of Uganda. I think by the time we reduce, in the process we are going to reduce on the losses. At the same time, if you have processing zones in these areas, I think it's another area where URA and other local governments can easily tap into the taxation. Otherwise, if they are disintegrated, it will be difficult to do that. But in the process, I think Daniel has touched on the issue of unpredictable policy regime in taxation. We have an issue, for example, when it comes to adding value on the packaging materials which come in. I'm happy to say that I interacted with Moses when he was still on this side in his office of the customs. In this area, we are being charged 100% tax exercise duty on importation of pre-printed materials, because we don't have a packaging industry, we don't devote packaging industry to package the coffee, teas, which can last long on the shelves. And this is a very, very serious issue for our value addition. And secondly, VAT charged by most of these manufacturers. VAT, I pay VAT at the time I've delivered my products, let's say to Uchumi, to all those supermarkets. But I'm paid after 6 months. So I've borrowed money to finance government. I call it financing because I borrow money to pay VAT on goods which I'm going to be paid after 3 months and 4 months. So that discourages value addition and also making it a formal sector in that area. Of course, high bank interest rate, Daniel has mentioned, but also by adding value, for example, to coffee, we would be targeting the regional market in coming to force the continental free trade area, and then also the other bilateral arrangements that we are going to have with the different countries, especially the countries which want to target for our roasted coffee, the Maghreb and the Western African countries. We wouldn't do that before because of taxation issues and other issues. But the CFTA in place, I think, would help us to penetrate those markets. So value addition is a must if we're to go forward. We have to do things differently. Exporting raw, of course, I'm not saying that we can add value to 100% all our commodities. But even if we did just 40% of these commodities, value addition will have more income and you have more taxation in the process.
Thank you very much, Ishak. Julius, let me come to you because there is, in Rachel's presentation, something around expenditure, and I know Moses also picked it up. Speaking to one or two people before, the update was released, the economic update was released, the biggest question was, all right, it's great to think about domestic resource mobilization, but can we address our public expenditure? Are we able to address the leakage? If we can close the taps, even if we bring in more money, the thieves will continue finding ways of letting it pass. So how do we then tighten the noose at the bottom and continue collecting the past so that even as we get in more money, we are able to do more with the revenue we are actually collecting?
Yes, I think that's another element we need to address, as government needs to address. Just look at one headline in one of the daily papers which said that government has increased the allowances of civil servants and politicians by 400%. And one who are calculating to come and stay in Kampala, it would cost you 600,000 plus and above. Why would I pay taxes to give somebody to come to Kampala for a meeting to earn 600,000 per day? I think I would try by all means not to pay that particular tax at all, I can tell you. So my level of compliance is also in tandem with how government is efficiently using its resources. And at that particular moment then is that government needs to cut down on its appetite to spend luxuriously. And that's something I wrote here for me. Our luxurious expenditure, one MP said, even if we tax oxygen, we will not have enough money to meet the expenditure side, the appetite for expenditure. Therefore, I think even our tax policy department, they fear the anger that the little they collect, they are not seeing the result or the return out of what they are putting, out of what we are spending. So reduce on these mushrooming districts, municipalities and sub-counties and the councillors. That's a huge amount of money that we can save. Let us reduce on the number of political appointees. That is so much that we can definitely use. We can definitely save. Let us increase our investigation and auditing. I was shocked that the Auditor General's office budget was cut. Then I was asking myself, who is going to look out on how our funds are being utilized outside there? So we need to target those sectors that are priority to us and they can be able to bring back returns in terms of improved quality of life. That is very important. Ensuring that the quality of service delivery has improved. If you look at our UP results and performance, you get a shock of your life. I mean, Moses has just presented a picture in terms of the absenteeism, in terms of how you are likely to get a wrong diagnosis. I was like, okay, I think we need to begin to look at some of the, it's so threatening. So for the government, I think for me is that one area is to ensure that our willingness is to know that our willingness to pay taxes is in tandem with what government is spending on us, and we can definitely say, yes, I have paid my taxes and this is the return I'm getting out of that. So for URA, for example, to start saying, oh, look at how our money has improved on Marago Hospital. Yes, people are going to relate to that very well. But also, it is more important to consult and say, okay, guys, I think we need to invest. If you pay more money right now, these are the areas we are going to put our money in. And once we find that there are those areas we are very uncomfortable about, kindly remove them so that we know that the little we have collected is able at least to, to bring returns to us and improve the quality of life. And lastly, for me, I think, Morris, is the whole question, which I want to bring again, is the whole question of this space that we are talking about. When you are in Kampala and you say, please, can you have more money on roads? People are likely to see what is taking place on the roads. People are likely to pay without little complaint. In other areas, it might not. So when you create spaces for us to understand why you are generating this tax, who is going to pay and who is not going to pay and why, it becomes easier for us to pay with little hesitation and to be able to explain to even our uncles and sisters and say, I think it is important that everybody pays a tax because taxation is the price we pay for civilization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julius. I wanted to make sure we have a microphone, a mobile microphone, because I thought I would get a couple of thoughts from one or two people before I return, because I believe some of the questions will come to you, Moses, because you are representing the ministry and URA in both capacities. So do we have a microphone? Yes. I wanted to ask, Francis, I've caught you off guard, but it would be nice to get Francis Kamlagesdi from PricewaterhouseCoopers. If I could get a microphone here. I'll begin with Francis and then I'll open it up. I'm happy to come to all of you, but let me hear what Francis has to say. Keep it open. I will not specifically ask you to delve into whether it's at the macro level on the tax policy or even at the micro when we talk about the exemptions. Just feel free to share.
Thank you, Maurice. I'll just say that I'm a taxpayer and I'm happy to be here, and thanks for World Bank organizing this. But I particularly liked the remarks from PSST. And I think it's really, really important that the leaders in this country lead by example. It's not acceptable. In fact, you lose the moral authority to demand citizens of Uganda to reach in their deep pockets and pay whatever taxes you're demanding of them when you're sitting on your high horse proclaiming and prescribing and not making a fair contribution. So you ask taxpayers and citizens why they're not paying tax, and again they're saying, what can you show for the taxes paid? And again, my argument and response to them is that you also lose the moral authority to be demanding of government to fix the roads, have medicine in the hospitals, and provide for the teachers if you're not making your fair share and contribution. So we also need to take out sentiments out of taxation. And there are so many so-called no-go areas, one of which is apparently agriculture. And I say, how can you say that you shouldn't tax agriculture when it comprises 22% of the GDP? And for what has been shown there, contributing only 1% on tax revenue. How can you say that it's right and fair for a teacher earning $500,000 shillings to pay 30% to government, but a farmer from Ishaka, from Kaberamaido, from Karamoja, who brings in a lorry full of cattle, each going for $1 million shillings, not to pay tax? And then you say, oh, those are poor farmers, that's agriculture, it's a very sensitive area, it's where the low-paid people are earning a living, and earning a living selling $1 million shillings to one cow, not paying tax.
So we need to get this rhetoric and sentiment out of the system and have a very open conversation about tax reform in this country. Yeah. Thirdly, we talk about the informal sector. We actually now know who is the so-called informal sector and what they are doing.
We now have the statistics. So if they are hard to reach, find a way of taxing them as soon as they come on the radar.
Yes.
And that may appear to be initially punitive, but usually they are the most demanding, whether it's the border drivers, whether it's the lorry drivers, whether it's the people mining sand, you name it. They are the ones who are contributing to that activity that we see in the economy. Then my final remark actually would be on trying to change this dialogue and narrative to discussions that the lady who was working in the market and the child who was smiling on the screen to actually understand. So when you talk to people about GDP growth, they'll ask you, we don't feel that growth. And I think we now need to talk about the economic development and the human development indices and really what it means to the man on the street, the woman on the farm, because it's true the economy is growing, but by you building the old road here and adding the hydropower project there and maybe a refinery and a pipeline, that's a lot of capital asset that goes onto the stock of assets in the country. But what does it mean to the citizens of Uganda? And the point that was raised, I think, by the gentleman from UMA about Bubu, Build Uganda, how much direct contribution in terms of employment, induced activity, in terms of the area where these dams are being built, in terms of supplier growth of the local raw industries, have these heavy capital infrastructure projects done to this country. You showed a screen, you showed a slide showing the growth, the relationship between the growth of the economy and growth of tax revenue and the buoyancy in the late 90s to the early 2000s. And I've been around for some time, and I know growth back then was coming from the investment in the telecom sector, the banks, lots of banks came into this market, and whereas there are issues about the services industry and the impact on the direct, indirect economic activity, they were creating employment. And they were buying from local suppliers, and they were actually investing and contributing directly to tax revenue. But if you look at the roads that have been constructed in this country, the hydropower projects that we have invested in, huge billions of shillings, and the oil and gas sector investment projects that are in the pipeline. First of all, those that have happened, how much have they generated in terms of local employment and also local purchasing power in those local areas? And if, I don't know whether it was the Christina who said that if somebody comes to you and says, oh, I think it would be nice to have a bridge here, and actually we can finance it, in fact, we can construct it, and by the way, when we construct it, we're going to bring everything from our own country, including the labor, materials, sand, cement, and steel. You'll have the bridge, $1 billion shillings, added to our GDP of 100 billion. That's 1% growth. But what has it done to the economy? And I think that's why we need to get that right.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you very much. All right. I'm coming to you because the microphone is coming, but let me come back to you, Moses. What social contract do we have, or does government have with its citizens? And because therein lies that relationship between us, the taxpayers, and the government. How are you able to encourage me to actually pay more tax?
Maurice, you know that's a very hard question for me. But if you recall, my PS before he left, he touched on that particular point. And worldwide, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, I think they are the best example. They have the highest tax rates and probably highest revenues that they could generate from the public, because they have a very strong accountability framework, and they are largely based on their system is based on providing services to the community.
Can't we be more accountable? That's what Moses is saying.
I think the debate that is on the floor regarding more accountability from government for the revenues that are collected is a pertinent issue, and I don't think government is shy about it. you all know that in this manifesto for this government, I'm not a politician and I'm not trying to speak for the NRM, but one of the key messages from the NRM on the Hakuna Mchezo message is about service delivery. And I think there is so much effort that government is putting in. Julius knows about this. He's constantly in our boardrooms, trying to see how best to improve service delivery. That is the social contract you're looking for. That there should be a direct relationship between revenues collected and services delivered to the public. There are challenges, but there is a lot of effort that is going on to try and bridge the gap. That's what I would say.
All right. That hand was up quite a bit. Yes.
Thank you so much, Maurice.
Keep it short. Your name?
Yeah, very short.
Yes.
My name is Ronald Nyakahoma. I'm a blog for Dev Contests organized by World Bank. I'm a technology entrepreneur. I have one comment and one question. The first comment is, we all know that we collect money and it is spent recklessly. And those things, when they are going to put things to be spent, we're always looking. So right now we're kind of into post-mortem of what happened. We know districts are coming up every day. Things are just not right. But what do you do? What do you do when you see those things are happening? It should be the question we should be discussing. Are we able to stop it? Are we able to stop the expenditure? What can we do? What measures should we put in place? I think that's the most important thing we should be discussing, not the post-mortem, how money is spent, how public servants are increasing their salary. That will not help much. But what should we do? How should we stop this thing from actually continuing to happen? Because however much money we spend, it will still be recklessly spent. Another thing is how we collect money. When you look at the people contributing to the GDP, mostly a service sector, manufacturing and all those things. All of them are formally in a formal value chain. So my question is, why can't we improve more in the informal sector by strengthening measures? For example, when you look at service, most people formalize their business when they want to get contracts, or when they want to get a bank account, or when they want to seek something. So why don't we focus more? How can we put measures to make sure that whoever is in the informal sector should be able to do that? So one more question which I wanted to throw to the panel is
very quickly. Yes.
Very quickly. So we know that the leading sectors like manufacturing, they're usually the companies that are leading, for example, telecom and foreign owned, they're not Ugandan owned. So the biggest companies are foreign owned. So you find that though they are paying taxes, but a big chunk of capital is taken out of the economy. It's not reinvested back because there is no guarantee that the owners of this business, they will actually reinvest it back. In the same way how you describe it with the roads and dams and all those things, the same to those businesses that are happening. So what should we do to make sure that this, the money gotten from the economy is at least reinvested back so that we can have more jobs and expanding of the businesses, not taken out of the country? What should we do about that?
Thank you very much. Okay. Barbara, if you can find me a lady, I'll be very happy. Find me a lady and give her the microphone. I'll come back to the other hands. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Proskovia Vikman. I represent the Urban Development Forum. Now, there are two things I think that came out from the discussion, and I want to agree with Julius. I think the distribution of wealth in Uganda was distorted long time ago. So you cannot milk a cow that you're not feeding. You would want us, I'm just saying one thing is, we all work for what? For good health, for better life. But if I can't access the basic, like health, and you're telling me you can pay an MP 39 million, but you can't pay my doctor 5 million, how do you want me as a mother to pay taxes for my kids to survive? That is one area that we need to work on, and the tax analysts in this country should look at the distribution. Two, foreign companies are getting tax holidays. Can you tell me in the last 10 years where indigenous companies in Uganda were given tax holidays equivalent to what the foreign companies were given. We seem to kill our own in favoring others. How are we going to develop Uganda, even its economy, or have our updates if we are depending on foreign investment only? I think the discussion should be, how do we balance the distribution? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Proskovia. Let me get the feedback. I'll come back. Julius, we'll begin with you, because I think Nyakahuma was very clear. I don't know if you picked his question. It would be nice for you to answer Nyakahuma and Proskovia, because one of Proskovia's questions goes to you. But the other, I would probably want to hear from the others, including Daniel, on how we can address the issues. Yes, Moses. Nyakahuma, yes.
If I got it right, he was talking about reckless expenditure. Is that right? Yes. But I think we've. Let me put it this way. I believe Mr. Nyakahuma, sorry. You have an MP. You have a member of parliament. I'd like to encourage you to raise this matter with your member of parliament. Yes, because I think we, as Ugandans, we all have a duty. Yes, I'm saying this as a citizen. Let me pretend not to be a public officer and try to be a citizen of Uganda. We should all be equally concerned about public policy and how it is conducted. And in this particular case, if the concern is about, as you say, reckless expenditure, raise this with your member of parliament. I like what Julius does and his group. They have been very open about their research and their findings about how best government can improve. I think let's be more proactive and and support Uganda to improve. Regarding the
unfair tax regime, yes,
the unfair tax regime, and specifically regarding
local investors / foreign investors.
This is a misnomer. Now let me tell you, and I would like probably, can I, with your permission, can I ask Mr. Kamlegia to explain this?
Yes, I can grant Kamlegia. Barbara, you have a microphone, you can give.
Because you see, there's a misunderstanding about tax holidays. The tax holidays that we administer in this country, they are in the tax law, and they are accessible to anybody who is eligible according to the criteria set out in the law. So I believe there are Ugandans, and we can adduce that, who are beneficiaries of these tax benefits which are in the law. But for purposes of neutrality, I would like to ask, if you don't mind, Mr. Kamlegia can shed some light on this. I'm not biasing him.
Very briefly, and again, I'm not a politician, I don't work for government, but I understand taxation. It is true, tax exemptions in Uganda do not discriminate between the passport that you hold in terms of nationality or the residence or originality of the investor. Lately, there's been a lot of transparency, and after every budget speech, there is a schedule that shows how much tax government paid on behalf of investors. And like Moses said earlier on, as a nation, you have quite a few instruments at your disposal, one of which is taxation. So if you're very particular about a particular sector of the economy, whether it is steel industry, whether it's edible oil, whether it is pharmaceuticals, then other countries can give a tax credit. Other countries can give incentives in terms of taxation. In our case, there are one or two industries where the government actually doesn't give a tax holiday, but actually pays the tax on behalf of that investor for a defined period of time. That information is available publicly. So it's not true that it's only foreigners that get tax holidays or tax incentives or tax exemptions. And when we have a forum like this organized by World Bank, very knowledgeable people, at least those of us here, let us be the ambassadors and advocates to try and demystify this information which is out there, because people continue with this misinformation and then it creates a mismatch. And Maurice, let me just make one other comment. The issue about so-called foreigners coming in and investing and make profits and then they take the money out, I've heard it in different forums, but as a government, you make a decision to liberalize the economy. Now, it's because of that liberalization that foreigners now come in as investors. They make the money, you take 30% of it, and then they're left with 70. When they decide to invest the entire 70 back, there's no tax. If they decide to take 70% back to their foreigners, you take another 15%. So for every $100 that a foreigner makes in Uganda, and they make a decision to take back some money home, government takes 45%. So for someone to say, close the economy, don't allow them to take the money back, you close this Uganda economy of ours, and you see what will happen.
Thank you, Francis. Barbara. All right. Yes, Daniel. Yes, that's the same question.
Yes, the same question. I just wanted to add something small. To say that there are also some sectors within which the level of investment required is extremely high, and there's inability locally to invest in these sectors. Let me give you an example. Uganda currently imports iron billets to the tune of about $280 million per year. But we have iron ore in Moko. Now, the amount of investment required for that kind of investment is not available locally. So these are some of the areas where it's important that the policy leads foreign investment to the areas where we cannot do it ourselves. And I think government has tried to do that. Recently there was actually an engagement, particularly on iron ore, and this can be replicated across other areas. And it speaks to the wider discussion on balance of payment deficits. Because if we are importing a lot of these items, at the end of the day, this is externalization of forex, which we can take back by having investments in these areas.
Julius, the question of inequality, there's a huge mismatch, and she's wondering, that divide that was created a while ago, how do we bridge the gap? How are we able to, that social contract we are talking about, be more inclusive, to bring more people on board so that they actually appreciate the value of taxation and its return for them as service delivery?
I think the point we need to appreciate, and probably my friend from finance, is that yes, our policy is not discriminatory, but considering the way we are structured in Uganda as an economy, you have a top-notch people who are so rich, and a huge majority of them are extremely very poor. And your policies are designed in such a way that it's those who are extremely rich that will actually continue benefiting from these exemptions and free opportunities. Look at this. He made a very good proposal around free, to participate in free zones. And they put a threshold of $10 million and above. So I'm like, if a potato grower in Cavalry, where you come from, for example, I don't know if in the Cavalry you're going to get somebody even to raise $1 million to be able to engage in the tax-free zone. So I think that is the point, is that in which way can we be able to say, if you are a promising entrepreneur and you are trying to grow, which kind of policies should we put in place to help you grow, shield you for, not for a long time, actually I'm against shielding people for more than 10 years, shield you for a long time, enough time for you to be able to become more competitive. And I think that's the question that our tax policy should be able to address. Then there, we are going to deal with inequalities in our society. Those who don't have will be able to have opportunities to engage in business fairly at a particular level so that they can be able to start running. And I think that's the point she was trying to raise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether I should give Moses or Rachel the microphone. There was a question Nyakuma raised, which I thought you touched on during your presentation. How can we capture the informal sector? How are we able to help, Moses and the URA capture the informal sector? I don't know. The two they can vote on who wants the microphone.
Thank you very much. To tap into the informal sector, you need to look at its characteristics. And as the presentation showed, one, the cash economy. Secondly, how hard they are to reach. Third, the informality. We also have data, which we also showed in the presentation, that shows which particular sectors are really largely informal. Each one of us eats fish, but the Bureau of Statistics shows the fisheries is 100% informal. And some of you that have gone near lake shores, you've clearly shown the amount of money that the fishmongers make. But when you come to the tax register, you're not seeing them in that arena. So what are we saying? How can we encourage the fishmongers to use less of cash than they are doing today? This is not a URA problem alone. It's not a tax policy alone. It is an economy-wide problem that needs to be addressed by all others. In others, my first answer is to address informality. Do not put your hands off and let URA or tax policy do it. The whole economy must move forward and tackle that challenge. Now, once you know where they are, say fisheries or agriculture, particular areas, then you can design particular policies that tap them. And we mentioned the fact that trace where these informal people link up with the formal sector. It may be a supply to a formal organization. A simple example is people plant sugar canes and they are informal. But at one point they supply the sugar cane to Kachira or to Rugazi. Now if you put a withholding on Kachira or Rugazi, that would bring them in. Yes. Unfortunately, the political landscape will come shouting that these are our people, do not touch them, which is what we now need to address in the DRM agenda. Yes, they're informal, but when they touch the formal sector, they may make as much as 100 million. Yeah. This is the reality now. Vis-a-vis a teacher who makes about 4 million in a year. So can we trace them when they link to the informal sector? And those are the small policies or measures that can be used to tackle this informality. But if they are shielded around the publicity, those are small, or these are our people, our voters, we will not get away. So it's an economy-wide issue which we need to address both at the political level and at the technical level.
Thank you, Moses. Thank you very much. Barbara, if I could take more hands. Yes, there is the gentleman in the Kitenge, I saw his hand earlier, and the gentleman next to him, and then we have a lady. Oh yes, I have seen also the private sector boss. I can't miss you, you know.
Enoch Nyorekwa, I work for the SDG Center in Kigali. I want to add a footnote to Moses' informality. I think when we talk about the informality, to some extent, we might also overestimate it. Because when I look at the numbers in the formal sector, for example, we have 1 million taxpayers on the URA payee. We have a labor force of 10 million people. But the same 1 million you see on the tax, on the payee, are the same who own cars. We own less than 1 million cars. We have maybe 1 million clients. So when you look at the informality, if there is vibrant economic activity taking place within that informal scope, then those people should be featuring in the other numbers. But we're not seeing that. And we need to actually, I think what we should be looking at in the next, probably for the World Bank, is to look at the impact if we tax the informal sector. What will be the impact on the wider economy? Because I seem to see it's probably that those who are actually in the formal sector are the same people in the informal sector. And so that could explain the same numbers.
So by day they are informal, by night?
By night they are informal. My other question is on to the UMA. I have not seen UMA. They are our large manufacturers, but none of them has actually ever registered on the stock exchange. Now that has implications for tax collection, because it speaks to the transparency, it speaks to the openness that the UMA wants to. Then my other question is on tax collection. Is Africa loses about 50 billion. That's about, in illicit flows, that's about $1 billion each country per year. But I didn't see that come into the debate here, and I think we need to give it prominence. My last question is on there was a curve on efficiency. I think from 2012-13, we seem to see either efficiency reducing or allocations to the URA for the recurrent budget reducing. And that's about the time when Keith took power in PSST, and also it's the time Kajina left office. Could those be related, the political environment?
I think you're reading too much into this report. But very nice questions. We'll address it. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Keep it short. Yes.
My name is Asman Glover from National Planning Authority. Now, I would start by thanking World Bank for this discussion. because I believe that as a country, we cannot sustainably achieve the development we aspire if we do not deal with the issue of domestic resource mobilization. We cannot continue borrowing and going through external debt and our donor partners helping us unless we tackle this. And we have had a lot of discussions on expenditure, efficiency of expenditure, but what has been missing particularly is how do we tackle the domestic resource mobilization. In that light, I really want to thank World Bank and this whole team, because we are starting this discussion in the right direction. That said, I have one comment that I have seen missing particularly in this discussion, is that when I looked at the analysis, we did see a few graphs which were comparing us to other regions. And I noticed when we broke down our resource mobilization, how we are funding, there is a big gap that we saw Uganda was doing badly, this mainly non-tax revenues. And I really expected us to really discuss this a bit more. We need a thorough analysis to understand the non-tax revenue the government is collecting. How much more can we get from this? We see for every mobile call you make, UCC is collecting money on that. There's a certain percentage. The question is, where is that money? What is it doing? And that's a discussion we need to discuss more, particularly if we did in a past reform on passport fees, and we saw that when we did that and URS started collecting passport fees, we saw an exponential increase in passport fees. We need to do a bit more analysis to understand which government entities are collecting non-tax revenue. Are they really being efficient in collecting that? Are we using that money efficiently? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Gideon Badagawa, private sector, Uganda, yes. Moses,
thank you very much, Maurice.
Question to you and Rachel. Yes.
And thank you very much, World Bank, and the presentations. I like the discussion. Thanks so much, the panel. Just a few comments in line with domestic revenue mobilization, which is our theme. I think every time we see an economy growing very fast, like we have been growing, except I think for the last 2 years, but on the other hand, you see a very low tax base.
Yes.
Then immediately that speaks to the informality of that economy, which I think is the subject of discussion now. How do we formalize the informal economy? Because if we hear that 21% is the contribution that agriculture is making to GDP, and we are not taxing agriculture, and tax experts are telling us that we are getting it wrong, how do we tap in agriculture? And I like the proposal that has come from Rachel to build linkages between industry and agriculture, especially the smallholders. That is critically important. It's a business model that has worked elsewhere that we need to use here. We have industries that can link up with the farmers who are in the informal economy. And like Moses is saying, we can use actually the withholding taxes every time they have a market and they are selling to us in the formal economy, we can be able to tap into that. That is something that we need to do for the food sector, for the textile sector, and so on and so forth. But two, we also need to encourage associations to form and make sure that every time we establish, if you are an industrialist, if you are a manufacturer, you should belong to Uganda Manufacturers Association.
Yes.
If you establish as a manufacturer, genuine manufacturer, if you are an insurer, if you are a banker, we have these associations. And once we belong there, then immediately we begin to speak to the numbers. That you have an association which is carrying the coffee farmers, which is carrying the poultry farmers, and so on and so forth. And the first thing then we would be able to do to help government is to do the self-regulation, to identify who is doing what, how are they doing it, what are the standards, and so on and so forth. Have you paid your taxes? And so on and so forth. And that's where governance begins. Someone has said we are not listing on the exchange, but governance begins there. Why are you hiding from the taxman? So these are things that I think we need to speak to. And the issue of savings, we are not saving enough. Government is not saving enough. Private sector is not saving enough. We have a problem of savings in this country. Voluntary savings, forced savings. We are not paying our taxes. We must pay taxes, all of us. Like everyone has said, we need to pay taxes. Every time you earn an income, you must pay tax on that. Yes. If you're not earning an income, it's a different matter. Yes. But provide the books, open the books to those that are supposed to be collecting the taxes, so that governance is very clear, transparency is there, and so on. Until we wake up to this reality as Ugandans, to pay taxes and finance our investments, we are not going to make a headway. And what is a tax base? A tax base is dependent on investments. How much you lay capital, that will invite the broadening of the tax base. Because whether you are looking at corporate tax, it's because someone has laid capital and is earning an income, is making a profit, so you go and tax them. You cannot get excise duty unless you have been able to produce and brought to the market. You can't build VAT unless people are consuming. It's a consumption tax. So if you have nothing to take for people to produce and consume, you're not going to broaden the tax base. So the whole thing is about investments. Pay as you earn. We are talking about informality. Part of the problem, Maurice, that we have in this country is that government is informal. Government is informal in this economy. They are not meeting their tax obligations. We are paying our pay as you earn, and if you don't pay as you earn, if you don't pay as you earn, as a private entity, you are able to wake up and come to you and put the padlocks, isn't it? But I am waiting for that day when URA wakes up with all the padlocks and goes to a ministry because they have not remitted their pay as you earn. They don't remit pay as you earn. They deduct but do not remit. Accounting officers must wake up to this reality. Then 3, on NSSF, long-term savings. We need to wake up to this again. 9 trillion is not enough. We have a potential to go to 30 trillion in this country, only if we do some reforms in the social security sector. We as taxpayers are paying for Moses when he retires and goes for a pension. We actually the ones who are paying his. So we're asking, can government have a pay as you, because they have been operating a pay as you earn, they need to have a contributory scheme so that you don't constrain the taxpayer. That money should go to build infrastructure and so on and so forth. So if we can do some reforms in the NSSF law, if we can do some reforms like establishing a contributory scheme, then we broaden the base for long-term financing. This country has a problem with long-term money. We all are looking at short-term money, 23%, 21%. We need to wake up to this reality. And then lastly, the NTR, non-tax revenues. We have just one project, PSF, which we are managing on behalf of government. And I'll tell you that that project, before even it completes, it's a 5-year project, we have been able to get back the money. $100 million has come back already before the project ends. How? If you went to URSB today, URSB is collecting 40 billion because of the reforms that we have put there. Look at the traffic, inflow, outflow of traffic. It is collecting 40 billion up from merely 400 million only 2 years ago. Why? Because of simple reforms that we have put, automation, online systems, and things like that. Now we are looking at the TREPS, the Tax Register Expansion Project, with URA, with the KCCA, and URSB. It's very simple. And you know what that is going to do to formalize the informal economy? And people are happy with this. Look at the land sector. It was very difficult for you to go and do a land search only 8 months ago. But now you go there, it's possible to be fast-tracked, to have a system where you can do a land search within about 4 hours.
Thanks, Gideon.
And all this points to one thing, that once we have the systems, the processes improved, it is possible that we can invite more compliance and be able to build the tax base as it's so required.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gideon. All right. Barbara, I really want to take one because I know Moses will take most of these questions. I had seen, yes, there's a lady there. I'm trying to balance this since the panel wasn't as balanced as we should have.
Thank you very much. I'm Esther Ndianabo, the mayor of Mityana Municipal Council. I've had this talk about the political environment, and I really appreciate what it takes and what it means to the society. We've had these political pronouncements, and I know politicians are the policymakers in this government, but at the same time, the saboteurs of the policies that they are passed. Why don't we bring on board all stakeholders? Maybe you are organizing a stakeholders engagement to bring even politicians on board. We enjoy this money as in salaries and other facilitations, but at the same time, we are the ones that cutting the legs that are standing. I think it's very wise if a stakeholders engagement was organized. I once thought about suing the highest man in power because of what was done on the taxi pronouncements, taxi operators' pronouncements. They are doing us a lot of bad. They impeached on service delivery because we are collecting a lot of taxes from those people, and we are now no longer collecting. I thought of suing the highest man in this land because he has done us not good. I think it would be good to bring other stakeholders on board.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you very much. Moses, I want you to pack the questions, the majority of them, as I deal with the others. So I'll begin with Moses. Let's begin, I think, at the top. The informality, I'm not so sure you want to be able to address because Moses may be able to pick on it. But there was a conversation around the non-tax revenue. You want to comment on that?
Thank you, Maurice, and thank you, fellow participants. Let me first say that it is true in the past we have not made enough effort to engage with the public and other stakeholders in the debate on taxation. It's never too late, there's always a beginning. I think going forward, we've learned our lessons. I think we will be more interactive with various stakeholders to get everybody to appreciate and to understand our tax system and to get people to buy in. Because I noticed that some of the issues that people are raising, some of the concerns, things which arise from not knowing or not having the right information. Regarding non-tax revenue, it is true our effort is the collections that we are making at the moment relatively low if you compare that to our peers, and we are concerned about this, and we have been making effort over the years. We publish every year as part of the budget a compendium of all non-tax revenues which are collectible by government. We also do an attempt to estimate what we think should be coming out of these different government agencies. But we know that we still have weaknesses with accountability, because what happens, until recently, the ministries and government departments would charge these are mainly fees that are charged for various services which are rendered by government agencies like UCC, Forest Authority, Mulago, Minister of Lands, the courts, registry, and so on and so forth. So in the past, they have collected this money and probably been allowed to use it at source or banked it on an account, which of course is authorized by the Treasury. But we now have moved to a level where we are saying that we should have one agency to receive all government revenue and have all this revenue into the consolidated fund, so that consequently Parliament can appropriate for everybody before they can spend. And Cabinet has taken such a decision already. So all non-tax revenue with effect from this financial year is expected to be received by URA and then transmitted to the consolidated account and appropriated accordingly. So there's a lot of effort going into this particular area, but we acknowledge that we need to improve. Regarding the informality, let me give you a different perspective from what we see. A bit of this is our culture. It's a cultural thing, the way business has evolved in this country. I think Ugandans like to do things slightly differently. We like to hang out in the kafundas in the evening. That's part of the informal sector. We love our borders, and yet you'll appreciate that it is easy to collect tax from a bus than 80 borders. It is easy to collect tax from Serena than all the mama so and so all over town, in Wandegea, in Aklavi, and so on and so forth. So, and this goes also into the financial sector. I know the mobile money agents and all these people who do distribution, it probably is easier to tap into their incomes through the service providers. But I just like to give you the picture that as part of the DRM, we are hoping that we will evolve a new culture, partly through legislation and improvement in regulation, but also in the way in which business is conducted. We cannot collect our potential of revenue in excises, for instance, if we allow, or we have a situation where people brew alcohol anywhere, anyhow, sell it anywhere, anyhow, to anybody. No, it doesn't work like that. If you parallel this with our neighbors in Kenya, I believe in Tanzania and Rwanda, there is some significant level of regulation in terms of where you brew the alcohol. You need a license in most respects. Where you sell it, the venue should be licensed. And then you can see better returns from this sector. I think 60% of the alcohol consumed in Uganda is not subject to tax, because we are only dealing with a few people. The rest is illicit. Now, how have we attempted as government to deal with the informality? Is through the withholding tax regime. We have this on our laws, but as Mr. Kamligeya suggested before he left, there's a lot of sentiments in taxation, and I'm hoping that this can be reduced. In the next budget, we've, for instance, proposed that people who are making income in the agricultural sector should be obliged to pay 1% of their income. And this is through a withholding regime. And we are simply saying that if Mugisha, you sell your sheep, I know cavalry is good for sheep. If you supply your sheep to meat packers, would like to designate meat packers as a withholding agent, so that if they pay you more than 1 million shillings, they should take away 1% as an advance tax, by the way, not as a final tax. If Julius here sells bananas, I don't know who this time shall we designate, because bananas are complicated. But the point is that anyone who is making income which is within the realms of the income tax regime of Uganda, comparable, for instance, to the threshold which the lowest taxpayer and a payee is paying, like a teacher, you should also contribute. And I'm hoping that
Ramadan Kareem, brought to you by NTV, turning on your world.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are often overwhelmed by the amount of change we want to make throughout the holy month of fasting. What we so easily forget is that a productive Ramadan is not about quantity, it's about quality of change. By focusing on one goal, you give yourself more space to reconnect and prove that you can do good in just 1 month. And all the other